I'm sure many of you that watch this channel, that follow me on Twitter, have been waiting for this video for some time. My thoughts on the Chicago Bears 2015 NFL Draft. Well, here you go. Here it is. So let's talk about it. Now, I know I said when General Manager Ryan Pace was hired that in some ways he was a reflection to me of some of the problems of the organization, and that he was in some ways more of the same. And I still kind of stand by that to a degree, that in some ways he is a bit more of the same. However, I do believe I also said that the ultimate judgment for Ryan Pace will come down to his ability to draft and run a draft and coordinate a draft and piece together a draft and execute a draft. And, any real judgments about him weren't going to be able to be made until he got a couple of drafts under his belt. That's just the nature of the beast. And I do have to say is that, as a Bears fan who's been screaming and hollering for a couple of years now that this team needs to undergo a full and complete total rebuild, I've been waiting anxiously for the 2015 NFL Draft because I wanted to see how that rebuilding project was ultimately begun. You hope usually that a new regime means a new direction, and especially in this case, because this is a team with needs everywhere. And I know so many people want to be fixated on the fact that the Bears' defense was so bad in 2013 and then again in 2014. Was absolutely of no surprise to me, and any of you that follow me know this. But this was a team that also struggled mightily on offense plenty of times and wasn't that particularly good offensively and oftentimes failed to establish any real rhythm. This was a team with needs everywhere. And when you finish 5-11, you have needs everywhere. And you can't pigeonhole yourself so much into focusing on one side of the ball where you completely criminally neglect the other side of the ball, especially when it comes to the NFL Draft. This is something that the Bears have done a horrible job with in recent years. You look back over their past 6 drafts, 2 of their first 3 picks have been devoted to the defensive side of the ball. This is Jets type of crap. And we saw how it worked out for the Jets, and ultimately the chickens came home to roost for the Chicago Bears. When you fail to execute on those picks that you do make, and then you've criminally neglected the other side of the ball, and you try to compensate with overpaid, overaged, overrated, overhyped, underproducing veterans, disaster strikes. And that's exactly what happened for the Bears in 2014. If you couldn't see it coming, then you're a moron. I did see it coming because I'm not a moron, at least when it comes to the Bears. So again, heading into this draft, I wanted to see what the strategy and the philosophy was going to be of this Ryan Pace-led front office. I wanted to see, was this going to be a guy that was going to be aggressive in moving up? Was this going to be a guy that was interested in accumulating additional picks? Was this going to be a guy that just stayed with best player available at each pick? Was this going to be a guy that was a need-based drafter? You don't really know until it happens. And I have to say this, part of my concern about Ryan Pace heading into this year's NFL Draft was based off of the history of previous Bears general managers in their first drafts. I look back at Mark Hatley in 1998. He took Curtis Enis out of Penn State with the 5th overall pick. Then I look back at Jerry Angelo with his first draft in 2002. It brought you Mark Colombo and legends like Roosevelt Williams. And I look at Phil Emery's first draft in 2012. Some will point to Alshon Jeffrey. However, you can't neglect the miss of Shea McClellan and the other legends like Brandon Harden and Evan Rodriguez. So the point being is that the last 3 general managers for the Chicago Bears, their first drafts went horribly awry. And I was most certainly hoping that that wasn't going to be the case here. And I thought it was going to be really hard for the Chicago Bears to screw up this draft because of where they were going to be sitting on the board in each round and how the board was going to break down. I anticipated the Bears were going to at least have a successful, if not pretty good or really damn good draft. And fortunately, based off of what I observed and what I saw, the Bears lived up to my expectations in terms of what I expected out of this draft. I thought they did a solid job. This is one of the better top-to-bottom drafts I've seen from the Bears in my lifetime, at least in the recent lifetime of, let's say, the past 20-plus years. This was a really good draft class. I really thought that the Chicago Bears ended up being one of the real winners in terms of an entirety, a total body of work when it comes to the 2015 NFL Draft. Now, there were a lot of reports at the 11th hour heading into that day 1 on Thursday night that the Bears were anxiously trying to move up to go get Marcus Mariota at number 2. And, at the end of the day, I didn't anticipate they were going to do it, nor did I really think they needed to do it just because of the cost that was going to be there. Yeah, I would have loved for Marcus Mariota to be a Chicago Bear. Don't ever get that mistaken. However, I applaud the fact that the reports even got out there, because at least that lets me know that this organization understands just how much of a turd Jay Cutler is, and they understand ultimately that they have to find a young franchise quarterback through the draft in order to ever hope to build a championship contender. That's just an NFL statistical fact nowadays. It cannot be disputed. So even hearing that talk, I'm like, you know what? Maybe this guy does know what he's doing. Maybe this guy can get the job done. Only time will tell. But when it came down to pick number 7, and it got to that moment, I thought to myself, the Bears have only one choice and one choice only, and they can't screw this up. And they didn't. They had that one option. They only had that one real choice at that pick, and they took it. And that was Kevin White, the wide receiver out of West Virginia. To me, the number 1 wide receiver in this year's draft class. To me, a top 5 talent in this year's draft. The Bears sat there at number 7. They ignored defensive needs, and they went there with, in my opinion, the best available player on the board. That simple. Now, would they have if Leonard Williams had fallen to them at number 7? Maybe, maybe not. But I absolutely love the choice of Kevin White at number 7. You got rid of Brandon Marshall. Alshon Jeffrey's in a contract year. You need to find out if Alshon Jeffrey could be a number 1 guy. And therefore, as a result, you at least, if anything else, have to give him an option at number 2, which Eddie Royal is not going to be. A Kevin White can be. So you're helping yourself out both short-term and long-term. You're not having to trade up. You're not having to do anything crazy. You're not reaching. Just a good, solid pick at number 7. And for an organization that so often screws the pooch with their first-round picks over the past 20-plus years, it was refreshing for me to sit there and see this team, in my opinion, get it right. And when it comes to first-round picks with the Chicago Bears, usually, more often than not, I'm right. If I don't like the pick, it's not going to work out. If I like or love the pick, it typically works out. Now, some of you will point to Kyle Long in 2013 as one notable exception, and perhaps to a degree I was definitely wrong about that. However, you are also talking about a guy now that is a right guard at 27 years of age that was drafted to block a guy that was on not the best team in the NFC North, in the Detroit Lions, and to block a player in Ndamukong Suh who's no longer even in the division. Just saying. Could have drafted somebody like Larry Warford a round later, gotten him cheaper, gotten him younger, gotten him better. My opinion. But then after the love affair I had with them taking Kevin White in round number 1, I can't wait to get my Kevin White jersey. I was really curious to see how day number 2 would transpire for the Chicago Bears, because there were a lot of different ways they could potentially go. And the way the board fell to them, day 2, they focused on the trenches. They took Eddie Goldman in round number 2, perhaps envisioning him as that nose tackle, that run stuffer that they need in the middle of that 3-4 defense. Maybe a guy that has enough versatility to play somewhat outside as a 5 technique in the 3-4. And then turn around in round 3 and address the center position that has been so derelict in terms of talent, with Roberto Garza manning the spot in recent years by drafting Hronis Grasu from Oregon. Day 2, focusing on the trenches. It's not so much that those were the biggest needs, but they were needs. And frankly, you could maybe make an argument that they got 2 pretty good values with where they went. And even in day 3, I look at how they did, and I see guys that could potentially contribute. Guys like Jeremy Langford, guys like Adrian Amos, guys like Tayo Fabaluje, if I hope I pronounce that correctly. These are guys that could all potentially contribute, and in a good universe could potentially start at some point in time for this team. So there's a lot for me to like about this Chicago Bears draft. Now, in day 2, would I have maybe went a little bit different with round 2 and round 3? Yeah, probably. In round 2, I might have went with somebody like Eric Kendricks, because the Bears desperately need an inside linebacker. And furthermore, I thought Eric Kendricks was a late first-round talent, and I had him higher on my board than Eddie Goldman. And then in round 3, I like Grasu. But, man, Duke Johnson was on the board. I like Duke Johnson in round 3 more than I like Jeremy Langford in round 4. I like more what Duke Johnson could bring to the table. I just thought he was a better prospect. But I'm not going to hugely knock Goldman and Grasu. I think Grasu has a better chance of being a long-term starter for the Bears than Goldman does. I have some concerns about Goldman, but I'm not going to totally knock the organization for making the pick either. In terms of the best pick for this organization, to me, it comes down to Kevin White at number 7, plain and simple. They needed a wide receiver. The board lined up perfectly. Where need met best player available. The Bears didn't get cute. They didn't sit there and just take a defensive player because that was the so-called bigger need. They took the best available player. It happened to be at a position of need, a guy with big-time upside in Kevin White. I love the pick on so many different levels. I think a guy like Jeremy Langford could surprise a little bit for the Chicago Bears. He's a lot of things that Kadeem Carey, last year's fourth-round pick, was not. He's faster. He's more explosive. I don't know quite yet if he's the long-term replacement for a Matt Forte, as Forte's going to be 30 this year and in a contract year. But I think Jeremy Langford could come in and instantly be the number 2 running back behind Forte and provide a much better complement and a much better change of pace to Forte. In terms of my second guessing in this draft, I was really surprised that they didn't address linebacker at any point in time, whether it be inside linebacker or outside linebacker. On paper, their linebacking core isn't that good, outside or inside. And I thought this was a draft that maybe they could have adjusted at some point in time. Now, granted, inside linebacker wasn't a great class this year. But, you know, some people might point to round 3 and say, why not take a Paul Dawson from TCU? Or in round 2, why not take a guy like Eric Kendricks or even a Benardrick McKinney? You know, I kind of got to agree with that. I kind of question the Goldman pick in that sense. I thought maybe the value on the board was a little bit better there with the linebackers in round 2. And then I also question not taking a quarterback at any point in time. Now, I understand this is not a great quarterback class. You know, you're a team that has missed on quarterback so often, so many times, in so many years, that you should continue to invest draft picks in that position because at some point in time you would have to assume that you could get something right. You know, I was surprised that they didn't go after a quarterback in this draft, and I thought maybe they should have. But overall, this was the first draft to me since 2008 where the Bears spent 2 of their first 3 picks on the offensive side of the ball. They had the right philosophy here. They weren't going to be so weighed down by the thoughts that the defense had far more needs that they were going to allow it to totally dictate their philosophy. I can at least sit here and say, when I look at Ryan Pace and what he did in this draft, that I could at least see where there's some potential structure to the draft board. And there's some potential competence to the structuring of that draft board. Where when I look at Phil Emery and how he ran his 3 drafts, for the most part, I don't think he had a clue, him and his staff, on how to structure a draft board or how to execute a draft or understanding values of players around the league, which is also a very important thing to know. It seemed like the Bears kind of got it here. No drastic reaches, a potential of a couple of steals. You know, it was interesting to me, too, that 4 of the 6 picks were redrafted positions from 2014. Is that an indication that Phil Emery was that bad? Is that just the way the board broke down? I don't really know. But again, what I do like about this draft is that I thought the Bears hit a home run with their first-round pick. I think they got a few guys that could potentially be long-term starters. While they didn't get the quarterback of the future, it was something they probably were never going to get in this draft, although maybe, again, instead of taking Grasu in round 3, maybe you gamble on a guy like Garrett Grayson from Colorado State. That might have been the other direction I would have went if I wouldn't have went Duke Johnson. I still think this was a really good, really solid initial draft for Ryan Pace as the general manager of the Chicago Bears. Was it perfect? No. Are there some things maybe I would have liked to have done differently? Perhaps. But I thought they did really well. They got some potential contributors and good values in day 3. They addressed some key areas in day 2 in the trenches, and they hit a big home run, in my opinion, with Kevin White in the first round. So I thought the Bears, again, were one of the big winners of the 2015 NFL Draft, and I give their draft class a grade of a B+. If they'd have been able to effectively address linebacker and or quarterback at some point in time in this draft, then maybe I would have even given them an A- or an A. This was a really good draft offering for the Chicago Bears, one of the best classes I've seen from them in quite some time. And while it's not going to produce a ton of instant results in 2015, and nor should it, it leaves me a little more optimistic about the future of the Chicago Bears than I felt maybe a few months ago.